Okay, so we've been discussing the relationship between the core, I guess, principles of Yibum, um, and especially the um, conundrum of how you balance the prohibition of Isser Eshes Ach, which is one of the arayos that is developed in Parshas Achribos. There, the Torah lists, several arayos and uh, illicit relationships. And normally, any kind of bond between these two parties would trigger a capital offense. At the same time, that's what Yibum is. Yibum, of course, refers to a situation in which the brother passed away, didn't leave heirs, and in order to perpetuate his legacy, the opportunity of Yibum is that the brother-in-law should uh, step into the, let's say, the marriage of his deceased brother. So this question is what we've been discussing. How do we understand the nature of this exception, let's say, to the normal prohibition of Isur Eshes Ach? So one way to look at it is that this is what we call dechuya, as we find in the halacha, numerous contexts that there are conflicts. Again, another example of this: every Shabbos there's a prohibition to do malacha, and yet there is an obligation to bring karbanos musaf, and bring a korban musaf entails doing malacha. So you know, uh, big day kahuna, certain types of big day kahuna that is worn by the, let's say, the Kohen Gadol, also includes, the mixing of tzemer and pishtim, which is normally kilayim or shatnez, and that's normally not prohibited. Techeles and tzitzis is sometimes, incorporated, with a baguette of pishtim. And, we find, many times that there's a conflict, between two different, requirements of Jewish law. Like any flexible legal system, Jewish law has to have the capacity to settle, to solve these conflicts, and certain principles, emerge. So, for example, again, when it comes to pikuach nefesh, that's an easy one for people to identify. Um, Human life is sacrosanct. We believe that very strongly, and consequently, with the exception of a few circumstances, when a person's life is on the line, when it's a matter of self-preservation. So pikuach nefesh is doche, with some exceptions. And once again, there's a discussion, a debate, like how exactly does that work? What is the status of the violation or the transgression that you violate in order to preserve your life? Is that considered a permitted violation, we'll call it? That's called dichuya. Or is that considered to be, simply, the outer range of the transgression is prohibited under normal circumstances, and when the cost is the loss of a human life, so then you're not permitted to transgress. It's not considered a transgression. That's when this becomes a completely permitted action. So that's the debate in general. We talk about dechuya and hutra. On Shabbat, on Yom Tov, for example, there's a heter ochel nefesh, right? Yom Tov is different than Shabbos, in that Shabbos is the 39 avos malacha, and they're prohibited. Let's say you didn't make your Shabbos meal, in advance of Shabbos. You're not allowed to cook, even if for the goal of having a wonderful oneg Shabbos, you're certainly not allowed to do that on Shabbos itself. On the other hand, when it comes to Yom Tov, Torah says in Parshas Bo that ach asher yachel l'chol nefesh hu levado yaseh lachem, that there's a prohibition to do malacha on Yom Tov. However, ach asher yachel l'chol nefesh, if if there's a need, to do malacha in order to further Simchas Yom Tov, the food, that you need for Yom Tov or other things, then, hu levado yaseh lachem, you are permitted to do this. That's called the heter of ochel nefesh. So once again, how do you look, just like with pikuach nefesh, how do you look at the heter of ochel nefesh? Is this a principle that overrides the Isra Malacha in question? Meaning you're not allowed to bake, you're not allowed to cook, you're not allowed to kindle fire, maybe on Yontif either. And in the context though of providing for a proper meal and so on, so we have a permissible that's permissible. So there are two ways to look at that. One is called hutra, this broad idea, which is the Isser Malacha was never pronounced, it was never articulated, in situations of Ochel Nefesh. And that's basically what the Ramban says. Ramban says on Yom Tov, what's prohibited is not any malacha, but malachas avoda. So if you look carefully in the language of the Torah, in Parshas Emor and Pinchas and so on, you'll see that almost always, Sefer Yom Kippur and Shabbos, usually the Torah uses the expression malachas avoda when it talks about Yom Tov. Ramban says because the only thing that's really prohibited on Yom Tov is malachas avoda, malachos shel yamim harbe. But malachas oswa yom l'shem hana, which is the heter of ochel nefesh, that is permitted on Yom Tov. Others, on the other hand, say no, that isn't really the source. The source is the pasuk in Parshas Bo. Ach asher yeachel l'chol nefesh hu levado yasel lachem. So, what am I trying to say? Both with regard to pikuach nefesh and heter okol nefesh, there is this massive debate, and that is how do we look at? There's no debate about what you're supposed to do. If you need to, cook and kindle on Yom Tov, for the sake of food, you're allowed to. If your life is in jeopardy, you must save your life even at the expense of transgressions. So there's no debate about the ultimate decision you make. The debate is a conceptual one, how to understand that choice that you're making. So one school says that what's really happening is a prohibition. It's across the board, but of course, there are times when it's permissible to transgress, because there's a greater payoff or a greater, danger, that you were avoiding. So if pikuach nefesh, if human life is sacrosanct and it takes precedence over everything else, then then you should violate. You are violating, but you're allowed to. It's permissible to violate. That's the right language. That's called dechuya, meaning the mitzvah overrides, pikuach nefesh overrides. Maybe from this point, if you were saying the same thing about heter ochel nefesh, you'd say heter ochel nefesh, the urgency of simchas yom tov and so on, it overrides, the prohibition. When you have an assay and it's confronts a los assay, if you were taking this position, you'd say the mitzvah assay overrides, the los assay. We have a rule in Gemara speaks about in Zvachim and Masachet Yoma, Tuma Hutra B'tzibur. If let's say you're trying to accomplish something in the Beis Hamikdash, and the tzibur are all tmeim, they're all ritually impure, and the only way that you can proceed and that you can accomplish what you need to accomplish is to ignore the fact that everybody's ritually impure, even though normally ritual impurity is an impediment. So we say there's a debate in the Gemara, Tuma Hutra B'tzibur or Tuma Dechuya B'tzibur. And that's, again, another example of what we're talking about. I'm just trying to portray for you, the big canvas of, this phenomenon, this broader issue. And so what we say is, one view is it's urgent that you bring the karbanos in the Beis Hamikdash. And that takes precedence even over transgressing, working in the Beis Hamikdash in a state of ritual impurity. Tumah. But the other perspective is that, no, that's not what's happening at all. The prohibition to be in the mikdash, to eat the karbanos, bituma in ritual impurity, that applies almost all the time. But it doesn't apply if in a situation where that will have the consequence of negating, the tzibur, the community's ability, to do this. So, for example, Korban Pesach, if everybody is Tameh, so it's Hutra B'tzibur or Dechuya B'tzibur. So the bigger question I'm trying to raise is that,
Is there a practical difference? In other words,
yes, we'll get to, I'm going to give you practical differences. Just give me 1 minute and I'll just let me finish this thought and I will give you some practical differences. There are typically practical differences. So just give me 1 more minute and I'll do that. But what I'm trying to portray basically is that whether it's Ochel Nefesh on Yom Tov or Pikuach Nefesh all the time, or Korbanos on Shabbos, or Korbanos in a state of Tumah, or for example, Bris Milah, right? The Torah says that if a Milah Bismana, meaning a Milah that is on the 8th day, sometimes, the baby is born and the baby, medically is not able to have a bris on the 8th day. That's called Mila Shalo Bismana. So if you can't do the bris Mila on the 8th day, then if let's say you can only do it, the doctor gives you clearance only on the 10th day that the baby's healthy enough for a bris Mila. And let's say the 10th day is a Shabbos. So you don't do the bris Mila on Shabbos. You only do a bris Mila on Shabbos Bismana if it's on the 8th day. But when you do a bris Mila on Shabbos, again, how do you look at what's going on there? Is that because the Isser of Shabbos, the prohibition of Shabbos, was never formulated, in the context of the stakes of missing out a bris milah, or no, bris milah overrides. You are transgressing Shabbos. You're supposed to transgress Shabbos, but it's considered a real transgression. So you asked me about nafkamina.
What's the nafkamina?
Just 1 second. So you asked me about nafkamina. I'll give you, some potential ones. It's a little complicated. But the Gemara, when it speaks about Tuma, Hutra, and Dechuya B'tzibur, and when it speaks about some of these other issues, discusses the following question: do these two factors that come into conflict, does the timing have to be exact? That's called bi'idne with an ayin. Idan, b'chol idan v'idan. The word idan means zman, timing. So the Gemara says, let's say, ase do chalos ase, a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. So there's a debate in the Gemara in different places. Is that only be'idne or shalo be'idne? Meaning, does the ase have to be accomplished at the moment that you're violating the lav? Let's say, in order to accomplish the ase, you have to violate the lav, but you're not going to get the payoff of the ase until a little bit later. That's called bi'idne. That's the factor of bi'idne. So some people think, Rav Soloveitchik thought this. I am actually a little bit dubious about this in one respect. I'll try to get back to that later. But, usually the requirement of bi'idne, meaning we'll call it the factor of simultaneity. In other words, that there should be no time lag between the prohibition that you are violating and the mitzvah that you are performing. Normally, that's understood as a function of dechuya, meaning if you're overriding the mitzvah, the Isser, in order to accomplish the mitzvah, then we need to justify that, we need an immediate payoff. We need an immediate mitzvah. If it's not bi'idne, so then that doesn't just, because you have a moment, you are violating, and right now this violation is not covered, right? It's not justified by the performance of mitzvah. That's one. I'll give you another nafkamina, also a little more complicated than I'm making it, but that many people initially at least perceive as this issue.
Can we play that out?
One more second, just one second.
The
factor of efshar lekayim shnehem. Can you accomplish both things or not? Like the Gemara says, that let's say you have Rov Tzibur. I'll give you the following example. Let's say the majority of Klal Yisrael are Tmeim. They're ritually impure. And therefore, we're going to apply, or we could apply the principle that, the korban could be brought, even in a state of ritual impurity, because of that. Is there any benefit at that point in time in trying to find individuals to represent Klal Yisrael who are tahar, who are ritually pure or not? I mean, one more time. the rule is that when there's rov tzibur, when the majority of Klal Yisrael is in a state of ritual defilement or impurity, that we allow the korban, certain korban, the korban chova, to be brought, a korban tzibur to be brought nonetheless. Okay, but the question is, at that point, if you have the majority, do you still, and you could find individuals who are pure, although they're part of the minority, right? Would that be better? And if that, is better, is it preclude, people who are ritually impure at that point or not? For example, let's say the people who normally there's like rules in the Beis Hamikdash. So Beis Hamikdash is a very fascinating place. There are all sorts of, administrative and bureaucratic rules too. So like, you can just imagine that the Kohanim, who were on duty, there had to be a system, and there was, of mishmaros. Otherwise everybody would be fighting all the time, to bring karbanos. So they split them up into families and days of the week and so on and so forth. So let's say in order to bring this karban, everybody in the group, that is designated, for this day of bringing karbanos, is impure, but you could go outside of the group and find somebody who is pure. Does that affect? So again, the more you think that things like that's called F Shalakaim Shneim, EF Shalakaim Shneim, can you accomplish both? If you can accomplish both goals at the same time, then maybe there's no need to override. However, that is all beidne, meaning the simultaneity factor, and efshalakayim shnehem, the factor of. I'm just going to take all questions in just a minute. We're going to try to be a little more, efficient. Just let me just finish this idea first. The efshalakayim shnehem, which is this idea of like, if you can have it all, then why compromise? And neutralize, a lav for the sake of the asay if you don't need to. Right? So if you take the dechuya position, then of course all this makes perfect sense. If you take what we call the hutra position, which is you're not violating with permission, you are not violating at all. Not just because you have permission, but because, when the stakes are, high enough, that the prohibition was never formulated. I'm talking about not rabbinic prohibitions. We're talking about biblical prohibitions. This mitzvah, this Isser was never said under these conditions, meaning the Isser malacha of Shabbos never applied to begin with to bringing a korban. Or the Isser of bringing a korban, betuma, maybe never applied in a situation where rov hatzibur is betuma. If that's the case, then it's possible, not necessarily true, but it's very possible that even if the timing is a little off, even if it's not beidne, there's no simultaneity. The point is that if the reason that you're violate or that you're doing this action, which normally is a violation, is in the context or framework of trying to perform this other obligation or imperative, so then even if the timing isn't perfect, because you don't need to justify the action, you just need to be in a framework in which this action is not being done gratuitously. It's being done in the context of the mitzvah. And the same is true with regard to efshar l'kayim shneim. For example, I'll give you another example. We say osek b'mitzvah, patur min mitzvah. It's another, interesting example. When you're involved in one mitzvah, you're exempt from another mitzvah. And this is a major debate. So the Balei Tosas say that that's only true if ef shalakayim shneim, meaning you can't do both things, and therefore you have to make a tough triage decision. So there are rules to figure out what takes priority. But if ef shalakayim shneim, just because you're osek b'mitzvah, why can't you? You should be doing both because. So that is a question of hutra versus dechuya. So what I'm going to demonstrate in a minute, I want to read the Ramban and then et cetera, and then I want to show you in our topic of Yibum, I want to show a couple of Gemaras where we see the parallel of these issues, whether Yibum and its relationship to Eishes Ach is Dechuya, or it is Putra. Okay, so but
So,
this the bigger one last thing to say before I take all the questions is that I've just outlined very broadly like the big picture of the halacha on clashes, right? As I say, Yom Tov and Pikuach Nefesh and Tuma and Osik b'mitzvah and Aseh Dochalos Aseh and Mila on Shabbos and of course Yibum and so on and so forth. Um, I'm not suggesting. What I am suggesting is that the question that we call hutra or dechuya, namely, are these actions totally permissible because the prohibitions were never intended, for these situations, or the transgressions are there; they're just overridden by the permissibility and the nafkamina that go. These are questions that apply to every single one of the. I don't remember how many there are. I think I listed like 7, 8 categories. But that doesn't mean that they're all identical. The question is the same. The answer doesn't have to be the same. It could very well be that uh, the resolution of this problem for pikuach nefesh is different than heterochal nefesh, which is different than tuma b'tzibur, which is different than mila b'shabbos, which is different than aseh dochalos aseh, which is different than yibum, which is different than karbanos and Shabbos. The question is a parallel question, but that doesn't mean that the halacha's answer in all cases, is identical. And that's one of the reasons that so what I'm going to try to show in a few more minutes is that when it comes to Yibum, we have two cases in Yibum. One is the classic case of Yibum, that's what we've been discussing, where you have Eshasach, the wife of a brother who dies, doesn't leave heirs. That's the mitzvah of Yibum. That's what we call an institutional clash between the mitzvah of Yibum and the arayos of Eshasach. But we also have what I'll call coincidental clashes. So, for example, let's say in addition, the party is it's a Kohen Gadol and an Almana. Okay, maybe meaning the Kohen Gadol is the brother of the mace. Okay, so that's in addition to being an Eshasach, there's also a Lav. So there, the Gemara certainly says that that's the principle of Aseh Dochalos Aseh. And that certainly seems to be mostly dechuya, meaning that you are violating, you're doing a violation permissibly, but it's a violation nonetheless. And that's why we'll see in a moment, there are limits on that kind of yibum that don't apply to the regular yibum. And that kind of gets us into the major debate. But before I do that, I want to take questions about what I just tried to present. There were a couple of questions.
right, can we just explain the nafkamina, make it clear? So I understand what Rabbi's saying, that if it's not at the same time, so I want to understand the other side. If it's not at even the asay's dochalos say, that's how I understand it. But if you hold it doesn't have to be at the same time, so then can you explain how that works? I'm not even understanding the other side.
I'll give you an example within Yibum.
Please.
I'll give you an example within Yibum, but it's not an uncontroversial example because there's a big debate how this works. But this is one of the cases that we'll be discussing. The Gemara discusses what happens if you have a woman who is a mu'uberes when her husband dies, meaning the husband
I
dies,
understand.
and she's pregnant, right? She's pregnant. So
what's the problem? You wait until to see what the result is.
Well, I don't hear the question yet before we hear the problem. What's the case?
No, I mean, you
wait
to see the result. If the child is born.
So if she is pregnant, let's say she is pregnant, and let's say he tries to do Yibum at that point. So this is a debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish in the beginning of Perek HaCholetz, which we're going to look at in a couple of minutes. So I don't want to invest too much in it at the moment because we're going to see it in a few minutes. There's a debate between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, about this. Maybe we'll look at it for a minute, and then I'll give you another example as well. also within Yibum.
So the one that okay.
Look at the beginning of Perek HaCholetz. This is Daf Lamed Hey, if you have in your Gemara. So this is the beginning of Perek number 4. So, we're all over the place, which is good. So if you look at the beginning of chapter 4, which is Lamed Hey Amud Beis, the Mishnah says, HaCholetz li'ivemto. If a person gives chalitza to a woman who his sister-in-law, after his brother died, who is pregnant, right? B'nimtzeis me'uberes, and it turns out maybe he didn't know at the time, but it turns out that she was a me'uberes. She was pregnant.
Just a clarification: he didn't know she was me'uberes when he made.
Correct. That's in the Mishnah.
It's not that he knew that she was pregnant, and he anyway made yibum.
Yeah,
we'll discuss that case in the Gemara too. But in here, it turns out that she was a muberes. The
one second. Don't wait.
Wait. Just give me a minute to bring the case.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Doesn't the Gemara say you wait 3 months? Doesn't the Gemara tell us you have to wait 3 months?
That's a din d'Rabbanan.
Okay, so d'Rabbanan's okay.
That's only if he
knows. But the Havchana is that's not relevant here anyway. The Havchana is for the purpose of knowing if there is a child, whose child it is. Because again, since there's a range of, some people give birth in the 9th month, you can give birth in the 6th month, 7th month. So again, obviously it's better to wait till the 9th month. It doesn't always work that way. So the din of Havchana is a way of establishing clearly the paternity of the child. But that doesn't mean and that's a din d'Rabbanan that you should wait before before anything happens. But on a Doraisa level, let's say, before the din of Havchana, let's say he or chalitza, of course, is another example. Let's say the chalitza is not a problem for Havchana. Right, only the Ibum is a problem for Havchana, because the problem of Havchana is a problem of paternity. But anyways, the Mishnah says, HaCholetz livemto v'nimtzes me'uberes v'yolda bizvan shazvlad shel kayama. So that's a whole discussion in the Mishnah. If you look in the Gemara says, Itmar, HaCholetz me'uberes v'hi pila. Let's say the other thing happens. Let's say you did chalitza. She was pregnant, right? It doesn't matter in this case if he knew or didn't know. V'hi pila, and then she miscarried. So it turns out that there is it's a very interesting case. At the time, it wasn't evident that she was omedes liibum, but it turns out that she did need yibum.
Why did he do
Zika. Just give me just one. I just want to finish the case. I promise I'll take the question. Just 1 second. Idmar choletz lemuberes v'hi pila. Rabbi Yochanan amar eina tzricha chalitza min ha'achin. Rish Lakish amar tzricha chalitza min ha'achin. There's an argument between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish whether or not the chalitza that he did. Now, it turned out he did a chalitza, and it turns out that she needs a chalitza. But when he did the chalitza, she was pregnant, so it wasn't evident, or it wasn't, necessarily even, fated or destined that she would need chalitza. So listen to this. Rabbi Yochanan amar ein tzricha chalitza min ha'achin. Rish Lakish amar tzricha. Why? Rabbi Yochanan amar ein tzricha chalitza min ha'achin. Chalitzas muberes shma chalitza. Ubias muberes shma bia. Rish Lakish amar tzricha chalitza min ha'achin. Chalitzas muberes lo shma chalitza. Ubias muberes lo shma bia. So there's an argument. This is a very fascinating case, obviously, and a very fascinating argument. Whether or not, obviously, being pregnant, and the possibility of either giving birth or having a miscarriage is a gray area, in terms of Zika, and the requirement of Yibum and Chalitza. Here we're talking about he did a Chalitza when she was.
Why don't you go by Rove?
Well, Rove might be a good way to, if you were forced to make a decision going forward, then going with Rove would be fine. But the problem here is
not only that it's a Rove Shabarov. It's an overwhelming Rove.
It is, but you can still. The point is that if she is, if she does miscarry, then even with a Rove and a Rove Ruba Deruba, it still turns out that she was, in a state of Zika. So if she was to get married, let's say right away, assuming that she was going to give birth, and then she would have a miscarriage, it would still be a problem of Yibum. So things like Rove, they help you, if you have no choice. But obviously, the best
on
thing
the other
here
side of the
is to wait
equation,
around and wait till the thing gets
on the other
resolved.
side of the equation, the pasuk says, if you want to do it literally,
Yeah.
that Yibum is required if he has no heir, he has no child. And since we know that even after 30 days, a child is considered to be questionable, so surely a pregnancy is not considered a child. So if you read the pasuk literally, he would have to do Yibum or Chalitza anyway, even when she's pregnant.
Well, no, I mean, it's more complicated than that. Say these are the Gemaras to look at about this. For example, the Gemara says later on about Pezayin Amud Beis. Let's say there's a child. Let's say there is a child, there is an heir, and let's say the child sadly perishes, later on. So the Gemara says you might have thought, that we would open up again and say that she's obligated to do Yibum. This is the Gemara in Pezayin base. The Gemara says we don't say that because of
I remember that.
the Torah is, very
And we were in
sensitive to
limbo. She'd
people's
be in limbo
feelings,
then, right?
and therefore there's not going, you're not going to play, yeah, at some point you have to be decisive about Yibum. But pregnancy, as you can imagine, is really an open question. The point I'm trying to make is as follows. So let's say what happens is that you're not supposed to do Yibum, obviously, at this point. And the Mishnah goes on to say that, what would happen, let's say instead of Chalitza, let's say he did Yibum with her when she was pregnant, Benimsis Muberes, Yolda, and then it turns out that she gave birth, right? So Bizvan Shavlad Shal Kayama Yotzi the Chayavim Bekarban. The Im Ein Vlad Shal Kayama Yakayim. So let's say
even
this
though
is going to be a tricky case, because let's say he went ahead and he did Yibum, and it turns out the child was
shouldn't
born.
have done.
He shouldn't have done, and she is.
And he can live with her for the next 7 months or whatever. And he can live with her for the next 7 months. It's one thing that he did what he shouldn't have done. And we're saying that until we find out whether she has a child or not, he doesn't have to leave her.
So what I'm trying to say is, you're not supposed to get involved in this.
That's a pretty dramatic.
Right. So what the Bali Tosa say is that according to Reish Lakish, who says that Yibum for a Muberes is not Yibum, and Chalitza of Muberes is not a Chalitza, even if it turns out okay, meaning, let's say it turns out that there was a miscarriage. So then it turns out in retrospect that there was a need for Yibum and there was a need for the Chalitza. Says the Gemara, nonetheless, according to Reish Lakish, this is inappropriate. So the Bali Tosas ask, just give me one more second. This is where I'm answering your question, I hope. So the Bali Tosas ask the following question. They say, listen, Im Tomar, L'Reish Lakish, this is on the second, no, Tosas Tigali, Bil Salamafre, on the bottom, towards the bottom of the page, in the middle of the Tosas. Tomar L'Reish Lakish, Hakonis Yivamtom Uberes Vihipila. Let's say, according to Reish Lakish, who says that any Yibum or Chalitza that you do when she's pregnant doesn't work, even if it turns out in retrospect that it was, needed. So let's say he would go ahead, he would say he went ahead and he was Kones Yivamto, and then she miscarried. So now it turns out that there's still a need for Yibum. But the Mishnah says that in such a case, he doesn't have to bring a korban, right? He only brings a korban if the child was born. In other words, if he did Yibum, ostensibly he's trying to do Yibum, and then it turned out she had a healthy child, so then there's a korban. Why is there a korban? Because he violated the Isra of HSA. There was no Zika Liyibum, so basically he had a relationship with his sister-in-law illicitly, and therefore he brings a korban.
But he should have brought the korban.
One second. So Tosas is asking the following question. Let's say it turned out seemingly good. What do I mean by good? Meaning it's not good. She had a miscarriage. So then it turns out that, that he is supposed to have some sort of a relationship with her, but he jumped the gun and he did Yibum in advance.
It's
right?
like mitzvah bava.
One second. Not mitzvah b'aver, but Tosas is saying, shouldn't he bring a korban, even though it seemingly turned out okay? Why? Because he wasn't supposed, according to the Reish Lakish, yibum and chalitza in a state of meuberes, it is illegal, and
Right.
therefore he didn't fulfill the mitzvah.
Why
And
do
if
you
he
have
didn't
to?
fulfill- one second, if he didn't fulfill the mitzvah, there should be a prohibition of eshesach, and eshesach requires a korban.
Why do you have
But
to
you say
wait
it's
for that?
only illegal or the rabbanan. Rabbi, you said earlier
No,
the
I didn't say
rabbanan
that.
only
No,
make
no,
it
no,
legal.
I did not say that. You asked me. You
That's a
asked me a
different
different question.
That's an
You asked me
almana
about
or
havchana.
a megusha.
Havchana is a din d'Rabbanan. Is the
Right.
requirement of havchana is a din d'Rabbanan. The din that a yibum or a chalitza, bisman shehima uberes when she's pregnant, does not count legally, even if it turns out that you need one, doesn't count as a chalitza. And the yibum, according to Reish Lakish, that's a din d'oraisa. So Tos asking to make one second. It's patience. Tosis is asking an amazing question. Tosis is saying like this. Everything that we're trying to analyze tonight revolves around the clash between the Iser Eshesach and the Mitzvah Yibum, right? I'm trying to provide you, as requested, meaning you, the group, as requested, with an example where there's no beidne, where there's no simultaneity in Yibum. So this is a great example of it, meaning what happened here? He had a relationship with this woman who is his sister-in-law, which under normal conditions, if there was no yibum at all, would be a violation that triggers a korban chatas. He did a b'shogeg, but it's an iser eshesach, right? But even if it turns out, that there was a requirement of yibum, the yibum wasn't chal, so he didn't perform the mitzvah either. So what did he do? He had a relationship with a woman which didn't accomplish the mitzvah of Yibum, right? Although she's omedes now to Zika and to Yibum. So Tosis wants to know, when Tosis asks the question, Tosis says, I don't understand why he shouldn't bring a korban, even though now she needs Yibum. But at the times, if it doesn't count for Yibum, then basically it should turn into Eshesach.
Tosa's
Right.
question is much stronger. Why shouldn't he have to bring the carbon right away immediately? He's not allowed to do it, what he did. So for that, he has to bring a carbon right away.
Right.
Now,
So the answer is.
unless you want to hold Brera.
So wait. So are you endorsing Tosis's question?
I'm saying Tosus had a stronger question. The day he did something wrong. End of subject. He was not allowed to do it. Okay? According to Reish Lakish.
No.
Okay.
Tosis is saying, even if it turns out, let me say it this way: if it turns out that there was,
there.
if it
What
turns
I'm
out that
saying
she,
is, it doesn't matter how it turns out.
if it turns out that she gave birth to a healthy child, then of course he has to bring a korban because there's no yibum and there's only eshesach. Tosis is asking the question in a more subtle way. Tosis is saying the Mishnah implies that if it turns out that she miscarried, in which case there is yibum, and therefore you would think that there's no eshesach, and therefore she's patur min korban. But it isn't so simple, because at the time when she was pregnant, there's no mitzvah of yibum at that time, and therefore there should be an eshesach, even if it turns out later that there is going to be a mitzvah of yibum. Meaning, what Tosa is saying is, you don't have the mitzvah, you only have.
I hear everything, but my point is that the carbon, the same rationale should have been brought the day he did the act. Because no matter what the end result is,
that's what Tosa is asking.
At that moment, he shouldn't have to
same
wait.
thing. The same thing.
Result. The other question is, does Brera play a role here?
Right. All Tosis is saying is, even if it turns out good, it's not good. If it turns out bad, it's not good, because either way, at the moment when he was involved with her, he wasn't fulfilling the mitzvah of Yibum, and therefore there should be.
I want to just add to it that Tosis should have said, and therefore the day he did it, regardless, you should have brought the carbon.
That's what they're saying. That's basically saying.
That's what he's saying.
Okay. However,
there's an answer.
I don't understand. Yeah. what?
I just want to understand something. If a woman is pregnant
Yeah,
when dies, right?
yeah.
So I had thought it's if she's pregnant, I thought we said earlier that there's no yibum or chalitza. It's done. Correct or incorrect?
No. If she has a child when her husband dies, and then something happens to that child later, then that doesn't make it. That's what the Gemara says in Zayin Amid Beis. That doesn't make a difference. There's no yibum under any condition. However,
But,
if she is
but
a midaris, that's a complicated issue, and there's a debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about some of the parameters of that. Meaning,
but
the if she has a miscarriage, then she is still
yes.
subject to yibum. If she gives birth to a child, then there is no yibum. But the question is, if there was a relationship between them in the interim while she was pregnant, so that's a discussion. That's a very interesting discussion of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. What am I trying to show? I'm trying to show you a case where
Not
the
nafkamina.
concept of yibum is operative in a bigger way, but the timing, there's no, that's usually what would be the prohibition of Eshesach and what would be the mitzvah of Yibum take place simultaneously, right? Here, because she is pregnant, right, according to Reish Lakish, even if, as you said, Brera, even if it, Lemafreya, even if in retrospect, it turns out that she was Omedes Liibum, it doesn't make a difference. The mitzvah of Yibum is not fulfilled in that engagement. And therefore, Tosis is asking, we didn't get to Tosis' answer yet. Tosis is asking, isn't this a problem of Eshesach, and shouldn't there be a korban no matter what? So the answer Tosis gives is fascinating. Listen to the answer. The Omari, Dafilo Hachilo Mechayiv, Midahava Koton Shabal Yevemto Gedola. The Omar Lakamon did Tagadlanu. Tosis points out that there's another case where you have limbo. We'll call it limbo, a case where there's no mitzvah, but there's not necessarily an iser of Eshes Ach either. And that is, let's say the brother is a katan, he's a minor. Let's say the woman is a gedola. So as a katan, he can't complete the mitzvah of yibum. But the Gemara seems to say later on in the very end of the Masechta, Daf Kuf Yud Aleph, that Tigadlen, I mean, they can live together until he's a gadol, and in the meantime, he's not in violation of the Isser of Eshesach, even though the full mitzvah of Yibum is not yet being accomplished either. So what's the takeaway from this Tosos, according to Reish Lakish or Katan? And that is that there can be a limbo period. There can be a situation where you don't violate Eshes Av, even though you're not fulfilling the mitzvah of Yibum. So Tosis is very begrudging about this. The Ramban, when he discusses this question, says it more forcefully. The Ramban says, of course, because as long as there's the potential for Yibum, there's no Isser Eshes Ach. Meaning, if you look at the Isser of Eshes Ach and the conflict and the mitzvah of Yibum as a dechuya problem, meaning the transgression is a transgression, just that it is overridden by and permitted, because the Yibum is of greater urgency, right? And therefore takes precedent, like we've been saying. So then you should need something like beidne. You should need the simultaneity. You should have to, fulfill the mitzvah at the point when you are trying to override the transgression. But the Ramban says, I don't think the question gets off the ground to begin with. As long as there is, a possibility of yibum, which there is in pregnancy, because there's always the possibility, sadly, of a miscarriage, until the child is born, right? It's omedes, she's omedes potentially to yibum. He says, then parach iser eshasach mimenu. There's no eshasach because
Isn't
it's
the
hutra, it's not techuya. So this is the
Ramban
Balitosis and the Ramban are consistent in this argument. So this is a good example, but I'll give you more examples in a minute of where there's a huge difference between saying hutra and techuya. Yeah.
Isn't the Ramban really saying that the mitzvah already started at that point, it's an elongated time frame. In other words, so long as once the potential starts, the mitzvah starts. So really, it is bidna.
No, he doesn't think it's a mitzvah the way the Ramban says it is. Once the Isser of Eshes Ach, is potentially, let me see if I can find the language here. I'll just read you the language of the Ramban.
He's saying the clock starts already. Isn't that what he's
The
saying?
mitzvah doesn't start so much as there's a framework for the mitzvah, and therefore, here, this is what he says. Delo matzinu yavama sha'asura b'shas nefila b'isur eshes ach ul'achar kein tisyabim. Ela ayin alav. Meaning, if truly we were worried about the Isser of Eshes Ach at this moment, and it wasn't Hutra, then it wouldn't go away. But the idea of Yibum is that when there's a potential for Yibum, there's no Eshes Ach. And therefore, even if you haven't yet fulfilled the mitzvah of Yibum, says the Ramban, you're still not involved in the Isser of Eshes Ach.
Would this be?
I'll give you another example.
This be also the reason why, when a younger brother jumps ahead of the older brother in doing Yibum, it's okay?
Yes. I mean, it's not, there's a pecking order. That's the Mishnah and the discussion.
But there's no Eshes Ach.
And Daf Yud Zayin and Daf Chav Daled. The language of the psukim is that, an older brother takes priority over a younger brother. However, the Mishnah says that if the younger brother, illegally jumps ahead and he just, does.
But
evil,
is that because of the
will
same
be
reason?
hal. But that's not the same in this issue at all. No, not at all. Because all these are legal acts of yibum or chalitza, even though there's a priority and a preference for order, but legally these are full yibums and chalitza. Whereas the muberes and the case of katan are incomplete or not, or undefined regarding the mitzvah. On the other hand, you say, oh, well, as long as there's no mitzvah, there should be an Isser of Eshes Ach. So that's kind of exactly what we are, confronting. I'll give you another example, and that is the Rambam's view of Abba Shaul, which I don't think is adopted by everybody. But I think I mentioned last week that the, when the Mechilta, Rashi quotes it in Parshas Yisro, says, there are a whole bunch of mitzvos and isurim shebedibur echad namru, that were, they were given simultaneously, let's say. Of course, the most famous, we discussed it last week, is Zachar v'Shamar, right? In the first Aseres HaDibros, which is where? In Parshas Yisro. It says, Zachar is Yom HaShabbos l'kadsho. In the second Aseres HaDibros, in Parshas V'eschanan, it says, Shamar is HaShabbos, Shmarta is HaShabbos, right? So it's Zachar v'Shamar. So the Gemara is, the Mechilta, everybody says, Zachar v'Shamar b'dibur echad nem. However, in the Mechilta that Rashi quotes, they say other things are also b'dibur echad nem, right? So Mechalaleha yimos yumas, the Isser of Malacha on Shabbos, and the mitzvah of B'yom HaShabbos, Shnei Kvasim B'nei Shana Timimim, which is the mitzvah of bringing Korbanos Musafim on Shabbos. That's b'dibur echad nemar too. And what else is b'dibur echad nemru? Yavama, the mitzvah to be miyabim when a brother deceases and leaves no heir, and the Isser of Eshes Ach, b'dibur echad nemru. So I think I mentioned last week that there are there are actually three interpretations I'm aware of, but at least the two main ones are two opposite, explanations. The Netziv, in his commentary, the Netziv is very prolific. He wrote, a lot, but he also wrote on very exotic works. He wrote many people know him for his Perush al Torah. I know that Rabbi Roth is a big fan of the Hamek Davar. Am I right? Because I remember coming for Shabbos many times, and he's it's sitting there in his makom. And he's a fan. I am too. But the Netziv also wrote Perushim on very more exotic works that aren't so well known. Just he had tremendous bekias. So the Bechilta and the Sifrei are the Medrash Halacha, and the Netziv wrote a Perush on them. He also wrote a Perush on one of the earliest Gaonic works that we have called the Shiltos de Rabbi Chai Gaon, the questions and answers of Rabbi Chai Gaon. So like
Shailas and Shuvas.
Hamek She'ela, the the tzivor Perish called Hamek She'ela. And on the Medrash Halach he wrote it's called Emek Bracha, I believe. So it's on that commentary when he talks about this line about B'dibur Echad Nemar, he says it means Dechuya. What it means is the difference between the lav and the aseh is like negligible. They're on the same continuum. If you're not doing one, you're doing the other. And he actually cites our old friend, one of my favorite, positions in Yibum, and that's Abba Shaul. He says, what does Abba Shaul tell us? We've seen it already. It's really Lamed Tes Amud Aleph, but it's also quoted on Gimel Amud Aleph. Abba Shaul says, if you can't do Yibum perfectly, then you're practically violating mamzer and arayos. Meaning, if you're going to marry this woman because she's a good housekeeper or because you are enamored with her appearance or because she, is an heiress or 100 other, let's say, lesser, reasons, pragmatic reasons, an ulterior motive, in other words, not because you want to fulfill the mitzvah of lahakim la'achiv shem. In other words, you're not doing the yibum lishma, very high standard. That's why, according to Abba Shaul, practically the policy is chalitza kodemis liyibum, because he was very skeptical that people could really muster the right motivation. So the Abba Shaul says if you do the wrong motivation, then the yibum borders on, or maybe crosses into, erva, and the child that would be born would practically be a mamzer. So then it's amazing netziv. He says that's what it means. B'dibur echad nemru. B'dibur echad nemru means, the difference is negligible. It's all on a continuum. If you're not doing one, you're doing the other, and you better be careful to do one perfectly right, because otherwise you're going to violate the other. Meaning, even as you're fulfilling this mitzvah, it's what the Chachamim say. They say Iser, in this case, Iser Eshesach. Iser hu derachi vale, meaning it's still there. The transgression is there. You just have to neutralize it with the mitzvah. And if you miss, if you're short, then the transgression's fully there. That's what Tekuya means. So the Netziv was basically saying that Abba Shaul's. Now, where did the Netziv get this from about Abba Shaul? So I'm going to show you this. I hope I'll remember to send in next week. But the Rambam has a comment in the Perish Mishnayos in Masechet Bechoros, his commentary in the Mishnah, and a parallel comment in a tshuva responsum that the Rambam, wrote, in which he pretty much says this, that Abba Shaul's view of Yibum is a kind of dechuya, meaning that, you have to fully fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum in order to justify the transgression of Eshesach, because that's really what's going on. Although the Rambam's view is that the Chachamim, who the Rambam thinks we paskin like, who do not require this high standard or this perfect motivation, he thinks the reason is because they think it's hutra. They think that, it's not like, that the Isser Eshesach is looming and lurking and you have to override it and neutralize it, perfectly. They think whenever there's no child and a husband dies, then there's no Isser Eshesach. End of story. And that's why we paskin like the Chachamim. Anyways, the more popular.
You can make the same logic for Hutra, and to say that the only reason.
Yeah, I agree. I'm just telling you what the Rambam
make it perfectly well.
Yeah. I agree. I happen to agree with you, which is why I said it the way that I did. But I'm telling you what the Rambam says. I'll show you the Rambam inside in next week. But the B'dibur Echad normally is understood, that's what I mentioned last week, the opposite way. Hutra, meaning B'dibur Echad means the same Torah that said that there's an Isser Eshesach, also said that there's a mitzvah of Yibum. And what that means is not that you're allowed to violate under these conditions. What it means is that it's not considered a violation under these conditions. But if that's the case, then you can have a gray area. You can have a little bit of leeway. That's why for the Rambam, holding like the Chachamim and not Abba Shaul is important. What he's saying is, for Abba Shaul, there's no leeway. You do this like, there's like this, sword of Damocles, that is, like hanging over you and, testing for any kind of, vulnerability, to swoop in and Eishes ach you, if you don't yibum perfectly. I'm just turning them all into verbs. But that's, says the Rambam, that's not what the Chachamim hold. They think that, that there's something, whenever there's a mitzvah of yibum, there's no Yisrael Shasach anymore. It's parach mimenu. And that, we'll see in a moment, that's the Ramban's, view as well. And therefore, even if it's not, this exact, second, it's fine. So this is also by, I had this Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. I'm going to give you another Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan to highlight where Tosas and the Ramban and Hutra and Dukuya, differ. Before I do, any questions?
Abba Shaul's position conflicting with the concept we have that the Torah doesn't tell us to do something that the human being can't, under reasonable conditions, do. In other words, Abba Shaul is saying that the concept of Yibum is not really able to be done. You need a malach to do that.
We don't need a malach, but what he's saying is it's hard. He obviously has a little more confidence than that. Otherwise, you're right. It's, and so lo nitna, you're talking about, there's a concept in the halacha called lo nitna haTorah l'malache hasharetz.
Right.
Which means that the Torah takes into.
If I remember correctly,
that people are human. So even Abba Shaul agreed. Remember that Abba Shaul's idea that chalitza is preferable, the way that it's reported is it depends on which generation. He said, "Oh, there are some generations."
I'm saying, didn't Abba Shaul say
sensitivity?
That we in our generation can't live up to that, which means
right, but people could, individuals could. Right. Like, by the way, that's a big debate in Psak. If for those people, the Rabbeinu Tam, the Balitos is paskin like Abba Shaul, so that's, the Chachamim don't. But if you paskin like Abba Shaul, and you think that you're in a generation where chalitza is kodemes, let's say you find an individual in that generation who you have confidence.
But it's a low plug, isn't it a low plug?
No, so that's a debate among the Mefarshim within Abba Shaul, whether there's a low plug or no. So you're saying it in a little, I understand where you're coming from. It is very hard. That's why he policy, because remember, in the Psukim, Yibum is preferable to Chalitza, of course. It's Yavama Yaval El.
You have the whole comment that he has to make when he does Chalitza.
Yeah, exactly. He says, Name Yavami, Yivna, bias, and so on and so forth. So it's clear. Conceptually, it's clear. But so what, this is some abstract halacha, like you're asking, so nitna Torah l'malacha asharis? Yes, no, it's not quite that much, but it is a challenge. And yeah, so I think that's the point. Any other questions? Because I want
to. What are the elements of a perfect Yavamu?
The perfect Yibum for Abba Shaul?
Yes.
It only means that you have to be motivated, sincere. You have to be motivated, not, there has to be clarity of motivation, that you're not doing this because, I always wanted to marry my sister-in-law, or I always thought that I wouldn't do anything as long as my brother was alive, but this is a great opportunity for me, on a level that has nothing to do with, Yibum. That's what he's saying. It shouldn't be Mishum Noi. It shouldn't be Mishum Mamon. It shouldn't be even Mishum, what he calls, and which is unclear, Ishus, which is, I guess, means like she'd be a great wife.
Internal elements. How can
it should only, the motivating force should be Lahakim La'achiv shame, out of respect for her and out of respect for him. Continuing, he has to look in the mirror and know that that's why he's doing this. Again, there is a debate how far, and again, it goes to
he's not only the protagonist, he's also his own judge.
Yeah, that is true. In the end of the day, he's his own judge. Now, again, most Rishonim do not paskin like Abba Shaul. I don't want to,
If you held like Abba Shaul, would you logically go to the point of saying that once a child is born, he should leave her?
So that is a great question. And, this is a discussion in the Yerushalmi, actually. The Yerushalmi raises that question about Abba Shaul, especially if you consider it to be a kind of a dechuya. So once he's fulfilled his mitzvah, but the truth is that to be fair, the Torah says l'kacha lo leisha, and l'kacha lo leisha, means that she's his wife fully. A little bit we encountered this when we were talking about Yehuda and Tamar. Like, why did Yehuda not continue with Tamar? Right. So, Velo Yasaf. So Velo Yasaf, Chazal say has two opposite meanings, lo hosif, or lo, siem. So, right. In part, but then they say, oh, but that was pre-Matan Torah. He was the father-in-law, not the brother-in-law. That's where the Netziv has this idea that, there are two aspects of Yibum. One is lahakim lach of shame narrowly and samik davar, and the other is, that she should become his wife. So it's a very good question. I'll give you another point, which is again very interesting, perspective. The Gemara says on Lam. Look for a minute on Lamed Tes Samad Aleph, and then I want to get back to another Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish if we have time. The Gemara says on Lamed Tes Samad Aleph that if you look at the middle of the page, Lamed Tes Samad Aleph, you see two dots. So the Gemara said, the Mishnah says Kinsa Hare.
Before the Mishnah.
What? Yeah, before the Mishnah. Correct. By the way, that's one of the Mishnahs that say that the older brother should do the Yibum.
Right, yeah.
Preferably. Okay, so then the Gemara says, Kinsa re ishto l'chol davar. If he marries her, she becomes his wife completely. Says the Gemara, Lamai hilchasa. Like, what do we mean by that? What's this telling us? Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, Lomar, Shemagarsha beget. Oh, you might have thought this is again all related to what we're doing here. Let's say he's miyabemer, right? So and then remember, there's no erusin in Yibum. Like a typical ishus, typical marriage has two components we've discussed many times.
Well,
One is the kedushin. You go to a wedding, harei mukadesh asli b'tabazu, or something like that, kesef shtar bia, and then there's nisuin, standing under the chuppah, going to the
Zika is the erusin.
When it comes to Yibum, there's no erusin.
Isn't the Zika the
Yibum.
erusin?
What?
Zika is the erusin.
Okay, but there's no. It isn't exactly erusin because, for example, let's say she betrays the Zika. She's not obligated to the death penalty like Harusa, right? So there are differences. Anyways, what's the point I'm trying to make? You might have thought if you do Yibum, there's no erusin. It's a different category completely. Let's say he does Yibum and then he wants to get out of the relationship, or they both want to get out of the relationship. It's equitable. So what do you need?
Yes.
Says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, a get. What might you have thought? That it's so different that you should get out through chalitza, right? So that lomar shemagarsha beget, even though this is an unorthodox marriage, right? Because it's built on the brother's marriage, or what the Rambam calls hikni lo min hashamayim, zika, so you might have thought that you get out through chalitza, but it's not true. You need to get, but then more than that, umakzira. And also he's able to bring her back if he divorces her and she didn't marry in the interim, just like in a regular marriage, if you're not a Kohen, he could bring her back as long as she didn't marry in the middle. Same thing is true if he was miyabem her, then he divorced her, and then they decided they wanted to reconcile and she didn't marry anybody in between, that would work as well.
That goes back to what you said before, no?
What?
Isha. That goes back to what you said before, because the pasuk says he's taking a liisha.
That's the source.
Once he's taking a liisha, then he's he's.
But listen to this. So the Gemara doesn't find it, so obvious because it doesn't say anything about it.
It's not so obvious because it's not Yibum the second time.
So wait,
it's not Yibum the second time.
Beget, says the Gemara. Pshita, isn't that obvious? And they're asking you a question. Isn't that obvious? So the Gemara says no. So kadaita chol uksiva lekachalo leisha v'yibma, right? Omer Achmana. V'adayin yivume arishon aleha v'chalitza in beget lo. I might have thought that the chalos ishus here is different. It's created differently, right? And therefore, it's a yibum kind of an ishus. And maybe the termination of a yibum kind of ishus is only through chalitza, right? Hamash malan. Therefore, we're being told, no, you need to get not chalitza. Point number 2, machzira. Listen, this is more important. 1 second. Machzira, meaning they can decide to reconcile, if she didn't marry anybody in the interim. Says the Gemara Pshita. Obvious. It's like that's true always in any marriage, except for a Kohen. Says the Gemara Sol Kadai Dechamina. Listen to this. Mitzvah de Rami Rachmana Alei Avda. He already did the mitzvah of Yibum. right? Hashta tekem Allah be'isur eshes ach. The Isur of eshes ach should come roaring back because the Yibum, which was holding it off, is finished.
This speaks for Hutra.
The way where's the what exactly? Meaning in the conclusion, not in the Habamina.
I mean, no, I'm saying the reason that all of this goes to the side is because there was never a Eshes Ach in this case. So
If there wasn't, that would make it much easier. Exactly. So the toast basically the Gemara is weighing. The Gemara keeps weighing in all sorts of different cases that Eshes Ach, how lurking, how looming, right, is it? And the more you say Dechuya, which means that, Eshes Ach never really went away, it just got overridden. So if it got overridden,
then it's going to rear its ugly head again.
It can come back, exactly. But if you say Hutra, which means there is no Isser Eshes Ach when there is Yibum, it was never said under those conditions. So then it's gone. The Ramban and Balitosis argue about this. The Balitosis are always troubled about Eshes Ach. For them, Eshes Ach is just, around the corner. It's always lurking. But for the Ramban, it's not lurking once you've done Yibum or Chalitza, because even in the context of the Yibum and the Chalitza, it's not that's not what destroys the Eshes Ach. What destroys the Eshes Ach is the objective circumstances that require Yibum the Chalitza. Namely,
the Gemara actually supports the Chuya, because by saying the Salkadaitis that it says all the time, that you might have thought, you could only have that might have thought if you were thinking it's the Chuya.
Yeah.
So the Gemara
so so it's hard to know whether should you be emphasizing the Havamina and say, but the Torah is Machadish nonetheless, or should you be emphasizing the Maskana and say, yeah, we thought that, but that was totally wrong. And this is exactly what you can see. What's so exciting about it is there are these objective questions, and then you have the Gemara. The Gemara is discussing this question. You know what I'm saying?
Usually we give a lot of credence to the Havamina of the Gemara. The Gemara doesn't have a Havamina without some legs to it.
Yeah, exactly, 100%. The question is what gets, in the final edit, what do we think? So turn for a minute. It's also in your Marmakomos to Tosas on Daf Ches Umad Beis, and you'll see that this is something with Tosa that the Bali Tosas join as well. Ches Umad Beis.
That's what that's.
So, and look at the
That's Ches or Tes?
Ches 8b. Okay, we actually have learned Daf Ches already. We go a little bit, a little unorthodox in our, in our organization, but we're doing things in a topical way. So, but we've seen the stuff. So the Gemara on Ches mentions what we just read on Lamed Tes, which is that in the case of Yibum, when there's Yibum and you want to terminate that Ishus, you need a get, and that there's Machzir Grushasa. So Tosas points this out. Listen to this. Melamid Shemagarsha Begetu Maksira. Everybody have that? It's the middle from the bottom, or you could say it's the fourth Tosas on the page, whatever makes you feel better. Melamid Shemagarsha Begetu Maksira. The Tosas says the Parakacholates, the Gemara that we just read on Lamed Tes Omid Aleph explains Amrinan the Itzterech. Right, you have to tell us this, Din. We wouldn't have known it. The Solka Daitach, because we would have thought mitzvah derami rachmana alei avda. He already did the Torah's mitzvah, which justified, transgressing. So hashta take a malah be'isur eshasach. So he's finished with that, and now the isur eshasach, which never went away, it was just overridden. It should be back. So then the Tosa says v'tema demashma delabia shnia lo tzarich kra lahatir v'amai. Mitzvah the Rami Rachman Alei Avda Mibia Rishona. Right? You just asked me the question like in Abba Shaul, right? Which is, does Abba Shaul think that once there's a child, they should separate? Because after all, maybe there's a real Dechuya. But so Tosas is asking the question a little bit differently. Tosas is saying the question is, what the Gemara says that when there's Chayve Lavin, if it's an Almana, it's a Kohen Gadol, we only permit doing the minimum mitzvah, and that is Bia Rishon. So then you have to then they have to separate. So what Tosas is asking you, forget about Chayve Lavin. What about a regular Yibum? Why not say, remember we said before, it's like Ef Shalakayim Shneim or Beidne. You have to fulfill the mitzvah in order to chase away the Isser Derachiv Alei, in order to chase away the Isser. The Isser Eshasak is everywhere, if it's Dechuya, right? So what we're saying is after Bia Rishona, apparently that's formally no longer the mitzvah. If it's that's not the mitzvah, then how do you? Then why don't you have Isser Eshasak over there already?
Really, the mitzvah to be a Rishona. I mean, that in itself is a chiddush because
it is. It's a chiddush, but it's a chiddush. It's a chiddush that we. No, I understand. Right. The Rishonim asked that question.
But you can't have a child without the bia.
Yeah. No, of course.
No, but the bia doesn't guarantee you the child.
Right. Okay, this is all. But
you're guaranteed without the bia, you won't have the child.
That's not the question. The question
right,
is
correct,
like,
guys.
You're Mekayim the mitzvah with just the bia, and you don't have a child.
Right. But this is the Gemara on Chaf Amud Aleph to Chaf Amud Beis, where the Gemara says that if you have Chayve Lavin, that all you're permitted is Bia Rishon. So what that means is that's the minimum performance of the mitzvah. So your question's a good question. The Bali Tosas asked a question on Chaf Amud Aleph. I just don't want to get into that right now. It'll get us too far afield. So what I want to explain is, what Tosas wants to explain is, he says Tosas basically asking Tosas, the Bali Tosas have the general view. We explained this last week on Gimel Amud Beis, and here Chesam Beis and Chafam. The Bali Tosas mostly think that Yibum is doche the Isur Veishas. They're very sympathetic to that view. The Ramah and the Ramban, I guess we'll have to wait till next week. They think Hutra. So Tosas is very bothered. Tosas says, listen, if it's Dekuya, like we said, we talk about, Bikuach Nefesh, Asedach Losase, Heterochol Nefesh, Mila B'Shabbat, the other questions. If something is Dekuya, that means that the Isur is alive and well and lurking, it's just overridden. So then the second that you're not neutralizing it, it's back. Just like the Gemara was saying about Machzor Grushaso. So Tosas is saying, why do you ask about Machzor Grushaso? What about Bia Shnia? What about in the marriage itself? If the minimum way to fulfill the mitzvah is already done, and that's the only thing we can justify in a case of Almana L'Kohen Gadol or Grusha L'Kohen Hedjot, meaning in a case of Chayve Lavin and Aseh Dochalos Aseh, why isn't that true for regular Yibum? Why do we let him L'Kachal Isha have a marriage? By the way, the answer of the Gemara is shocking. I mean, and the answer is not shocking.
In the Grusha is a much
fascinating
case, because in the Grusha he's ended his relationship, so you can go back. You close the door. That's one question. The fact that he made just one bia and whether that should be sufficient, that's a secondary question. It's much. I don't see the parallelism. The
parallelism is if you believe in Dekuya, and if you learn from Chayve Lavin that the asay is fulfilled, or the only fullness of the asay is only B'Bia Rishona, which is what that Gemara says about Chayve Lavin. So then the question is, why? And you think that a regular Yibum is also Dekuya?
I hear you. But
what's just? By the way, listen to the answer.
Definitely admit that
the answer is fascinating.
The Grusha is a more extreme case. You can definitely admit that the Grusha is a more extreme.
No, it is. The one said by the Gemara, the other is a question of Tosas. But the logic is similar. So listen to the answer. Dabia shnia lo dachi chayve lavin. That's part of the proof. Kedamar perik sheni. Listen to what he answers. B'yeshlomar. I'll tell you before I get to read you Tosas' answer. I'll tell you the Ramah's answer and the Ramban's answer is simple. They say, "What are you talking about? There's no Isser Eshasach in a regular case of Yibum because it's Hutra, right? Meaning it's not lurking and it's not looming and it's not ready to pounce. You don't need to keep staving it off, with this mitzvah every second."
Tosas has to answer it according to their.
But Tosas has more trouble because they hold Dechuya. That's why they're comparing it to the. Listen to the answer. The answer is fascinating. You don't need a pasuk to teach you that. They're not just even bothered by the din. They're bothered why this din doesn't have to have a source, because it isn't obvious. The svarahu de lo amarachmana yavo aleha legarsha achar biyarishon. If that's the classic case of Yibum, says the Balei Tosas, it's not seemly, it's not logical that that's what the Torah wanted you to do. They wanted you to do this thing. Maybe part of it is what you said also, which is that, doesn't, it's not a great prescription for fulfilling the ultimate goal of lahakim lachiv shame, but it's not what even Tosas is saying. I'll just tell you what I think this Tosas means, which is quite remarkable, and that is, later on, I mentioned before that and with this, I guess we'll have to conclude for today. I mentioned before that on Daf Pei Zayin Omid Beis, later on in the Masechta, the Gemara discusses what happens if he has a child when he dies, and that later on, before she remarries, let's say, the child, or even if she did, let's say the child, tragically passes away. Would that open up Yibum again? So the Gemara says no. Why not, though? So here, it's a very remarkable Gemara. The Gemara says because of the principle of Diracheh Darchei Noam V'chol Nesivoseh Shalom.
In limbo.
Which is remarkable because that's it's a pasuk initially, it's a general idea. But I think that's what Tosas means here as well, which is what we're gonna go to all this trouble of Yibum in a regular case. I'm not talking about Chai V'Elav. And Chai V'Elav's, you don't have a choice. It's a coincidental clash, and here it's not a coincidental clash, it's a clash, but it's still an institutional clash. That's what Yibum is. Yibum is overriding Eshesach, So since they are related to each other, it's like what Tosa says on Gimel Amid Beis and Dalin Amid Aleph, which we saw. Mitzvaso b'kach v'yafshar b'inyan acher. So even if it's a dechuya, it's a bigger dechuya. It's doche a little bit with a greater, a measure, let's call it, of leeway, of flexibility, than a regular dechuya. A regular dechuya, it's like every second there's this, conflict. And the question is, who, has, the greater, power to overcome the other. That's what the halacha says. So it has to be be'idnei, it has to be ef shalakayim shnehem, it can come back, etc. What Tosas is saying is, even though this is dekuya, still it's an institutional clash. And therefore, it doesn't necessarily have to be completely be'idnei. And therefore, what the Torah is going to, create such discomfort, and the goal is lahakam lachiv shame, and this is such a transcendent, cause, that it causes us to, rewrite, the laws of erva and ishus, to create a category called Eishes Hameis and Zika and a Yibum, without Erison. We're going to do all that, and it's going to be over, be a Rishona. Clearly, the idea is also to create a marriage, which is a tribute to and a legacy to, but also has independent value, as what I call Kedushas Ishus Shal Yibum. So Svara, he says, Tosas, even though Eishes Ach is a factor, if you do Yibum properly, it doesn't end within the marriage. And then the Gemara thought, but maybe after the marriage, if there's a gerushin, even then it doesn't, because you did the Yibum correctly. So it overrules.
On the words Leisha, that it should be similar to a reasonably marriage. It's easier.
Yeah.
No, Tosas would have an easier route instead of twisting themselves into.
No. But Tosas is just saying, in the end of the day, what you see from Chai V'Elav that Bia Rishona has is where the formal mitzvah.
Because you don't have the words Leisha in the Chai V'Elav. Here you have the words Leisha, which would mean that the Torah is trying to tell you something, that this has to replicate a marriage in all ways.
So if you, on Tosas on Daf Chaf Amud Beis actually does say something like that. If you want to look at it for a minute, then we'll stop. If you look at Tosas Chaf Amud Beis, it's a good point you're making. Tosas says, why don't you just say that, since she's his wife, so they can continue in their relationship. Look here. This is where the Chai V'Elav Gemara is. But it's very interesting, the consistency within Tosas and the consistency within the Ramban, throughout this whole labyrinth of laws, which are very complicated. Even the cases are complicated, as we see. So look here at the bottom. You see the second to last Tosas, Atu Bia Shnia?
Yeah.
So go down, one line. See, it says, Ve'ein lahatir bia shnia. Same question. How can you permit,
Second.
be a shnia and a regular yibum, meaning a continued physical relationship beyond the first engagement, and not in Chai Lavin. So Tosa says, why wouldn't you permit it also in Chai Lavin? After all, mitam dynastis ishto l'chol davar, because once he does yibum, she becomes his regular wife. That's really what you're asking.
Right.
And he's implying that that's kind of why it's that way in regular yibum when it's not chavilam. But the answer is, de'eno nasas ki ishto elahecha deshara le below dechia. Since it's chavilavin and it's such a tight, dechuya, she's only ishto. She needs a get from him, but she's only ishto in the heter sense, where the mitzvah saseh overrides the lav of grusha or almana or mamzeres, as the case may be. But he's asking a question exactly your way, the way you asked it, which is, there's a marriage. Let the marriage be the explanation of why they can continue. Aval, he says, chayve lavin afilu bir rishona lo shari elim shum da'asi ase v'docha lo sase ubi ashniya delay sase lo dochi. Here he's distinguishing. Here it sounds even a little bit like he's saying hutra, which is one of the few. There are some achronim who think that of all the tosasin, this is the one that says.
No question that the protagonists of Hutra have an easier job.
Yeah.
Than
I want to pick up next week with more of this Tosin Rabban, but I also want to talk about the following case, just to think about, and we'll start with it. And that's on Daf Yud Amud Beis. We're jumping around a little bit. On Daf Yud Amud Beis is an argument between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. I'm not going to read it now, but I'm going to tell you what it is. Let's say the Yavam does chalitza with the Yavam. And then he decides he wants to marry her. After the chalitza is done, he has a relationship with her. Would that be the Isser of Eshes Ach? Or, for example, let's say, forget about the Cholates or the Yavam. Let's say there are 3 brothers, right? And one of the brothers does either Yibum or chalitza.
Is he doing it for
one of the brothers does
or...
chalitza. Then the other brother has a relationship with this woman. Is that an Isser Eshes Ach, or is that a prohibition of chalutza? Or, for example, I'll give you one other case. Say they're all the same, basically.
Wow.
Let's say there's more than one wife, right? Like before Cherem ben Gershom. Let's say Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, right? So Ruvain had 2 wives, let's say, and he dies, no children. Let's say Shimon, the brother, did chalitza with wife number 1, right? Now Shimon wants to have a relationship with wife number 2 after the chalitza. Is that a violation of Eshes Ach? So that is an interesting argument between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish was of the opinion that at least with regard to the other wife or the other brothers, it's Eshes Ach. The language that he uses, Kidakaimi Kaimi, Eshes Ach, is still there. Even after the chalitza, there's some aspect of Eshes Ach. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no, once one brother did Yibum or chalitza with any of the wives, then there's no Isser Eshes Ach for anybody else, ever.
Would Reish Lakish hold the same thing if he did Yibum instead of chalitza?
Yes. Yes. If he did Yibum, and let's say another brother wants to
let's say she died afterwards, because they can't be, if they're they're not 2 sisters.
Not sisters. Meaning Reish Lakish was of the opinion that the Isser Eshes Ach is very much alive and well, even after the family problem has been resolved. Meaning one of the brothers did resolve the Zika with one of the wives. Still, the other brothers and the other wives have an Eshes Ach problem if they would want to have a relationship. And Rabbi Yochanan says they're not allowed to have a relationship. However, it's not an Eshes Ach problem because Eshes Ach is long gone. The Eshes Ach is gone once there was a Zika, and certainly once the Zika was resolved, even if it's a different brother and a different wife.
Even that would
we'll talk about that next week.
That would be easier with a Hutra approach than a Dechuya approach.
No, Rabbi Yochanan is better with Hutra, and Reish Lakish is better with Dechuya, right?
Right.
So I want to talk about that case because it's also treated differently by the Ramban in his commentary to Sefer Mitzvos of the Rambam, and it's consistent with what he writes in Torah Adam, and the Balitosis treated this very differently, and I think is totally consistent with their perspective. There's something inspirational about, it doesn't always work out, consistency, but but when you see that there's a pattern, it's really
And this is not an Ashkenaz Sfarad dichotomy?
it
You
partially
always
is.
ask that, Lishitosa.
I think that a lot of the
Because their
Balitosis,
thinking is different. The
no, I do
Ashkenaz-
think so. I think a lot of Rashi and Tosis are operating with Duchuya, and most of the Rambam and Chachmei Sfarad are operating with Utra. So I do think that there may be something to that. It's interesting I've never thought about whether or not that is also true, like across different topics. As I said before, the question of Hutra Duchuya is an endemic question when you have these kind of clashes. And I've been mentioning 8 to 10 different categories of it. It would be interesting to see, it's the same question, but it's not necessarily the same result. So, it's an interesting point. Definitely in Yibum, the Chachmei Sfarad are much more inclined, to the Hutra approach, and the Chachmei Ashkenaz to the Duchuya approach. I think that's clear, with some exceptions on both sides, especially the Rajba on the Sfarad side is more complicated, and there may be some.
I don't want to say this as a generality, but the Balitosis are more minutia driven, and the Chachmei Sfarad are sometimes more macro looking at things.
Yeah, and that may be. I mean, again, the Balitosis
Duchuya is a more complex.
Right. The Hutra idea is very much. I do think you're right. Again, this is like a meta halachic, comment, but I do think there's something to it. Like, the Ramah, the Ramban, their school, they're a little bit more abstract, I think, in certain, respects. And the Rambam certainly that's the case. So that's what I'm saying. It would be curious to test it across, not only Yibum, which I think, I do have a very strong impression, about that. But what about, let's say, Tuma and Pikuach Nefesh, and is it also true there that the Chachmei Sfarad are more, abstract in their approach, like Rav Nissim Gaon, and the Ramban, both think that even Aseh Del Chalos Aseh is a kind of a hutra, which is interesting. And there, for example, the Ramban thinks that Heterochol Nefesh is a kind of a hutra. So I think that there's something to what you're saying.
Rabbi, isn't this in line with the fact that the Chachmei Sfarad are more societal when they look at problems?
Not that much so, but they were more philosophical.
As opposed to the Ashkenazim that deal with minutia that very often is not relevant, or people.
No, I don't think it's a question of relevance. I do think that.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, this is like a big Jewish history question, which I don't want to get
Yeah,
into.
let's stop attacking Ashkenazim.
But I think the idea in Ashkenaz, the Jews of Ashkenaz, and it's been demonstrated by more recently in historiography that that some of these distinctions are not as rigid as previously thought, but it is true in a bigger way that in terms of secular education, exposure to the philosophical and scientific culture surrounding them, Jews just had more, they were much more integrated into the societies of the Mediterranean, Babel, and then Spain. And in Ashkenaz, they were more isolated, in terms of themselves. Again, not as rigid as was previously
It's
thought
flipped a little
in
bit.
terms of the newer information. However, there's something to that, and in terms of their knowledge of other cultural. What? Yeah, so I think there's something to that. But yeah, either way, you have to be careful in
Generalizing.
Yeah, categorizing.
to be careful just to make sure that you follow through with the details and it isn't just but definitely in Yibum, that definitely is the way that the patterns go. Okay, have a great week, everybody. We'll continue with this.
Sure. Thank you so much,
other
Rabbi.
things
Sure.
next. Okay.
Thank you.